How's that for sound? Perfect. So first of all, I really do want to say thank you so much for inviting me. This seems to be a really very special congregation, and I can honestly say I've never been to one like this before. Um, which is a really wonderful thing. I've been a Unitarian since I was 7 years old, and you guys keep on surprising me, so it is a delight and a privilege to be here with you this morning. Now, with that said, everybody brace yourselves, because I would like to start us off with a Bible passage. This is from the book of Luke, chapter 8, verse 43. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years. And though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. She came up behind him being Jesus, and touched the fringe of his cloak, and immediately her flow of blood stopped. Then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When the woman realized that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had immediately been healed. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." I will first declare my obvious bias in that I am not and have never been a believing Christian. With that out of the way, I will now make my claim that I don't think this story is about having faith in Jesus. To be fair, the authorial intent is very clearly to write a story about having faith in Jesus, but if we were only ever allowed to read this book as the authors intended it, the Bible would have gone out of fashion a very long time ago. I, for one, choose to interpret the Bible how I imagine a God of love might want me to, with empathy and compassion and a positively reckless disregard for the preferences of institutional power. So, when I read this piece of text, and I read the part where Jesus says that the woman's faith has healed her, I don't think he's talking about faith in him. The reason I think that comes down to simple math. See, popular consensus holds that Jesus of Nazareth was actively preaching for about 3.5 years. The text of both Matthew and Luke tell us that the woman in this story has been experiencing a flow of blood for 12 years. And Luke's account holds that she has already spent all that she had on physicians. For 12 years. Maybe as the result of complications in childbirth, or a miscarriage, or a uterine cancer that would have been undiagnosable in that time and place, or an infection for which she had no reliable treatment, this woman has been bleeding. And for 12 years, she has been seeking help. 12 years of managing the hygienic realities of bleeding with no running water, of being poked and touched by a long procession of presumably male doctors, of spending all the money she has on cures that do not work. 12 years into this, she hears through the grapevine that some religious type is wandering around town healing people with magic, and she thinks to herself, yeah, I'll give that a try. This is a story about a woman who has made a choice to have faith many times over. This time it might be faith in Jesus, but she has also placed her health in the hands of many physicians, and probably also midwives and relatives and friends. This woman does not have the advantages of advanced diagnostic technology. She can't get a CAT scan. She doesn't know why this is happening to her or what will make it stop. Her only options are to make peace with her illness and go about her life the best she can, or take several leaps of faith and try to control her own health. I think there is something illuminating about how different people react to health concerns. Most people in the world are not medical doctors. and even those who are tend not to be omniscient. Most of us do not have a thorough knowledge of how our bodies work and how to make them work again when something goes wrong. When we do anything to affect our health, like exercising or getting vaccinated or drinking fancy tea, we are also revealing where we have put our faith. The past few years, I think, have taught us all a great deal about faith. When something undetectable entered our world that killed people at a terrifying rate, we all had to make very high-stakes decisions about where we would put our faith, and we had to do it quickly. Which news reports were we going to believe? What sources of information were we going to trust when we were trying to keep our families alive? In whose hands were we willing to place our lives? Even after years of living under the cloud of this pandemic, if I am asked how the COVID-19 virus makes people sick, the truest answer is that I still don't really know. I have a loose collection of facts in my head. Some of them I learned in these years, and some of them half-remembered from high school biology, but not nearly enough to rely on my own knowledge while navigating a global health emergency. The options in front of me are to guess what will work, or have faith in the expertise of other people. Personally, I have faith in the scientific process and in the values of a formal education. When I needed to know how to keep my loved ones safe, I turned to representations of those institutions: doctors, scientists, epidemiologists. I still stand by that decision. I do not want to disregard, however, the very real reasons to distrust those same institutions. The same Center for Disease Control that issued our COVID guidelines also conducted the infamous Tuskegee experiment between 1932 and 1972 to study the effects of an untreated syphilis infection. The experiment involved recruiting about 400 black men with syphilis who were all told that they would be participating in a 6-month experiment. Without these men's knowledge or consent, the experiment actually continued for 40 years. Because the purpose of the data collection was to study untreated syphilis, none of the men being studied were ever treated, despite penicillin becoming widely available long before the experiment ended. More than 100 of these men died due to lack of treatment. More recently, both the CDC and FDA had very adversarial relationships with ACT UP, an activist group dedicated to fighting HIV and AIDS. In the late 1980s, ACT UP members besieged both CDC and FDA headquarters. The CDC and FDA had been slow to update diagnostic criteria or release new drugs to treat the disease. But ACT UP members had been conducting their own exhaustive research for years, often testing experimental drugs on themselves. The siege protests aimed to force both organizations to use the life-saving research that protesters had already conducted, because every day that passed without effective treatment left more people dead. See, even today, I don't always trust the recommendations of doctors or the broader institutions they represent. You see, I am a transgender person. I started transitioning from female to male when I was 20, about 7 years ago, and for 6 of those 7 years, I have been on hormone replacement therapy. Throughout those 6 years, the only doctor I have ever had who understands how my hormone dosage works was the one who gave me my first prescription. Every subsequent time I have sat down with a new primary care physician or any other doctor, I have had to explain to them how my hormones work, what they do to my body, what my doctor needs to prescribe for my hormones to continue working, and how they need to phrase the order to the pharmacy for my insurance to cover it. Most of that information was never given to me by that first doctor, by the way. Most of what I know about how to manage my own hormone therapy, I learned myself over years of trying to get pharmacies and insurance companies to give me the right kind of testosterone in syringes. I have an enormous amount of faith in my doctors when I need a flu shot. I don't have as much faith in them or in any institution they represent when I need to address the specific needs of my transgender body. I'm not bringing up my personal history or our national history to try and spread doubt about the efficacy of vaccines or masking or any other life-saving medicine. I will remind you, I am fully vaccinated and I feel very good about that decision. I don't even mean to imply that the CDC has a more dubious record than any other part of our national infrastructure. You cannot look into the history of any major American institution without finding something repellent. Such is the nature of a nation founded on slavery. My point is, the decision to have faith is never an uncomplicated one. Institutions are flawed. People are flawed. And no God worshipped by any human being has yet delivered a world without suffering. There are always good reasons to choose doubt over faith. And yet, when certainty is impossible, we must rely on faith if we are to take decisive action. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a master of finding faith where there was ample reason to doubt. And I'm not referring to his tremendous faith in God. Dr. King led activists in years of protests founded on the principle of nonviolence. And nonviolence should not be confused with pacifism. Nonviolence functions by exposing the violence inherent in an oppressive system by using nonviolent acts of resistance to provoke indefensibly violent retaliation. This only works if the empowered group can be moved to change by their conscience. Dr. King once wrote, "Bomb our homes and threaten our children. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our communities and drag us out on some wayside road, beating us and leaving us half dead, and we will still love you. But we will soon wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And in winning our freedom, we will so appeal to your conscience that we will win you in the process." Imagine the faith required to proceed as if the people bombing your home, threatening your children, and beating your aging parents half to death have a conscience. I often wonder exactly how Dr. King came to that conclusion. But looking back on the legacy of his activism, I am reminded of a concept I recently learned in seminary. Dr. Carrie Doring is a widely respected scholar and practitioner of pastoral care. She was also my professor earlier this year. Dr. Doring teaches that, in each person's unique worldview, there are ideas and convictions that can become life-giving or life-limiting. A belief in a just God can become life-limiting when it leads believers to question what they must have done to deserve their suffering. The same conviction that God is just can be life-giving if it helps a suffering person believe that they will not be abandoned in their pain. I think that the phrase life-giving can be usefully interpreted to be literal. There is faith in this world that, when acted upon, gives life. We have been shown this truth 1,000 times. By women who persist in seeking medical care in spite of dehumanizing encounters with their doctors, driven by their faith that they deserve to be taken seriously and made well, even if a whole chorus of doctors disagree. We see faith give life when activists wrestle medical institutions into submission to demand access to life-saving medicine for everyone who needs it. And we all saw faith give life with every victory won by Dr. King's cohort of civil rights leaders. As Unitarian Universalists, we are committed to a responsible search for truth. When the objective, definitive truth cannot be found, I think it might be a good rule of thumb to place our faith where it can become life-giving, in the most literal sense. I have faith in the medical miracle of vaccines that have already spared me and everyone I know from the ravages of polio and measles and smallpox. I also have faith in the hard-won experiential knowledge of transgender people who I have seen thriving in a world that has barely begun to make room for us. And when existential dread threatens my will to keep trying, I might try to follow Dr. King's example and have faith that people can choose to be better, even if they never have before. This is the kind of faith that can make the world better and give us all fewer reasons to doubt.